Good, excuse me. Good morning and afternoon, POD. Um, I'm recording this on Monday night because I don't feel very optimistic about being able to make it into class tomorrow. So, if I do, then you'll never see it. If I don't, then here's your notes for tomorrow. Um, so last time we talked about the list of grievances that the colonists had with the King of England. Among those were no representation without taxation. Taxation with no representation. Um, they were forced to pay for a war that they didn't really want or start. They were forced to house and feed British soldiers. So there's a handful of things that they weren't real fond of. Here is a continuation of that list. Today we'll talk about this list. We'll talk about some of the people that signed the Declaration of Independence. We will get your next project. That'll be due a week from Tuesday. So you'll have plenty of time to work on that. Finish up your papers, work on your project. And hopefully I will be back on Wednesday. So as we talked about some of the list of grievances yesterday, they kept adding to it. Talked about natural rights, life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. This was a couple of these were more everyday, like life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness is kind of a tough thing to tie down. But one of the issues that the colonists had was that all the judges who presided over all the cases were English appointees. So the judge would get paid by the English king or the English government. They were appointed by the English king and the English government, and the English government could decide how long they were judges. So if a colonist had a complaint, legitimate, not legitimate, whatever the case might be, against the English government, it's one of those deals where you can imagine how that would turn out. If your boss gets to decide how much money you make and how long you get to work, and he wants you to take his side over somebody else, you're probably going to take his side. Along with that, one of the reasons this was an issue was that the colonists didn't feel like they had a right to a fair trial. And so when you would go to court back in the day, it was just the judge making the decision more times than not. So we talked a little bit about the Boston Massacre, and we talked about how John Adams defended the British soldiers. But one of the things that, you need to be aware of is the fact that the judge was English. And so English soldiers in front of an English judge, an English appointed judge, regardless of some of the information provided, whatever the case might be, there was a really high probability that the English soldiers were going to get off. So the American citizens wanted a right to a fair trial in front of a jury. The mercantilism that we talked about, like the first or second slide, where the English colonies controlled all the trade, how much you could get, you had to buy things from us, had to sell to us. That was an issue, obviously. They wanted to abolish the charters. So there was a handful of different charters that were signed throughout the course of the English colonies that restricted their ability to do business or to conduct and govern themselves as they saw fit. So the colonists wanted to be able to do away with those. The colonies had a whole bunch of issues, and the King of England just said, nah, whatever. It's one of those deals where if you have a problem with somebody, say, hey, this is an issue, this is an issue, this is an issue, this is an issue, and there's never a resolution. After a while, you get a little bit fed up. So they renounced the king's authority to govern the colonies by waging war on them. So this was a declaration of independence. They declared that we are no longer subservient to England, and the only way that you get out of that situation is through war. The other thing that they had an issue with is, much like the French did in the French and Indian War against the English started to try and team up with the Native Americans and get them convinced that, hey, if you help us fight the colonists, then we will provide you with some of the land that was taken from you and stuff like that. So obviously that was an issue. You won't you won't need the majority of this. There's not going to be a question how blank changes were made to the Declaration of Independence, but just some facts that you need to know. There's 86 changes made as they sat down and discussed the Declaration of Independence. Over 500 words were taken out. You can see right there, 1,300 words were a little over 1,300 words were included. There were 18 people who signed the Declaration of Independence who were under the age of 40. 3 of them were in their 20s. Half of those 56 signers were either judges or lawyers. 11 of them were merchants. 9 of them were landowners and farmers / slave owners. 12 were doctors, ministers, and politicians. Your question for your summary tonight or today will be this: do you think there was any consequences for severing ties with Great Britain? It should say, what do you think the consequences of severing ties with Great Britain would be? So some of the impact that it's made today. So even though the Declaration of Independence was signed over 250 years ago, there is still lasting effects. Unlike the last list with the amount of merchants and landowners and farmers and stuff, this you will need to know. So some of these things, and I've touched on them already as we went through this, but one of the big tenets in the Declaration of Independence is liberty and freedom. And we talked about how that did not include slavery, because even though all men were created equal, the Declaration of Independence viewed slaves as 3/5 of a human. So they weren't technically a full human, therefore they weren't technically free. And like we talked about last year during U.S. history, this led to the Civil War. A couple other things it did is it sparked the women's rights movement. So as the 1920s rolled around, and a little bit before the 1920s, but as the early 1900s rolled around, women were starting to exert more control over their destiny, and they used this as a source of inspiration. Same thing with the Civil Rights movement. Civil rights in the 50s and even through today, a lot of the civil rights things and tenets they take is this: life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. That's one of the lasting impacts. It influenced the French Revolution. I know we haven't talked about the French Revolution. We won't talk about the French Revolution. But if you've ever seen movies like Les Mis or something like that, they talk a lot about the French Revolution. And after the French people saw that the common folk could rise up and overthrow the most powerful empire in the world, the British government, it really inspired people. Latin America. So again, last year when we talked about United States imperialism, we talked about a whole bunch of things going on in Latin America, and a lot of that, the Declaration of Independence was an inspiration for them. Vietnam War. So the Vietnam War, Ho Chi Minh was the leader of the North Vietnamese, and he used the Declaration of Independence as a reason. Now, it wasn't a great reason, but he did use it as a reason to invade South Vietnam as a justification. During World War II, we talked a little bit about how Germany was attacking ships off the East Coast. Japan would randomly pop up on the West Coast and shoot a rocket at the United States, or float balloons over. We talked about all the wacky things that both those countries tried to do during World War II last year. And so during World War II, they kept the Declaration of Independence locked away in Fort Knox. And if you've ever been to Washington, D.C., and had a chance to walk around some Smithsonian museums and on the National Mall, you will actually see the Declaration of Independence. Be careful. Nicolas Cage might try and steal it from you. So these are all the people that your next assignment is going to be based on. It's going to be a short presentation. You're going to pick one of these guys. We're not going to go through this list in great detail because just like last year, if you guys pick one of these people and you talk about this person, we're not going to spend a lot of time talking about it and testing on it. Now, John Adams, we talked about John Adams being the second president of the United States. There's way too much information on John Adams. So John Adams won't be on the list that you have tomorrow to choose from. But here's all the people from Massachusetts. You can see two people, Sam Adams and John Hancock, both had significant prices on their head for their roles in the Boston Tea Party and other things like that. There's Connecticut, and those four guys right there, including one of them who was elected governor of Connecticut 10 times, so fairly successful politician in Connecticut. Pennsylvania, there's one person in the Pennsylvania delegate who did not sign the Declaration of Independence. That is John Dickinson. Ben Franklin, much like John Adams, is also off the list. The next thing that we will cover for this will be Benjamin Franklin. We'll have a few notes on that, so he's off the board. Maryland, there you see Charles Carroll, was the last signer to die. He was 95 years old in 1832. There's Virginia. You have Francis Lightfoot Lee, who was a relative of General Robert E. Lee. Then you have Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Harrison. Thomas Jefferson will also be off that list. Again, any former president that's on the list. There's probably a little bit too much information about him as compared to some of the other people. Here's New York. There's only 3 people from New York. Now, one of the reasons why there's only 3 people from New York is the fact that New York was still fairly British. So New York City was British controlled for the majority of the Revolutionary War. It was a major port in commerce between the United States and England. So New York State, or New York Colony, had a lot of loyalty to the British Empire. So there wasn't very many delegates actually from New York. There's Delaware. Some more information on the signers. 9 died of wounds during the war or hardships. So not every one of the 9 who died during the war actually was shot or had an injury from that. But a lot of the war was personally financed by these guys, and so they went broke and couldn't afford to feed themselves or take care of the families. So that was, when it says hardships, that's what hardships entails. 5 of the signers were captured, and of all the ones that were captured, they were all obviously brutally treated because the English government was quite upset with the Declaration of Independence. 12 of them, so a lot of these people had land and houses where the the Revolutionary War took place. So 12 of them had their houses burned in the course of the war. 17 of the 56 lost everything they owned. But even after this, so they lost all their stuff, had their houses burned down, all this stuff. They never went back on their word. All stood by their Declaration of Independence. The other thing that's unique to the signers is, just like most politicians now, as you come together, they're fairly well off. So they all had fairly large estates. Two of them didn't have any families at the time. The other thing that's unique is each one of those people who signed the Declaration of Independence, each one of them that wrote the Declaration of Independence. If you're a wealthy businessman, if you're a wealthy business owner, if you're doing well for yourself, and you decide to upset the apple cart and completely go against what's happening right now, that's a significant thing. So they all had more to lose than to gain. Freedom is great, and they all wanted their freedom. So they wanted freedom to be able to make as much money as they could, but it's tough when it's like, okay, well, I've always done it like this, and I've always done it like this, and this has been very successful for me, and then all of a sudden you just completely switch directions. That's a little bit scary. And we talked about John Hancock. Had a price on his head. Him and Sam Adams. And that is the end of the Declaration of Independence. So, I'll post this on Schoology. I will post the list of signers of the Declaration of Independence. If I'm there tomorrow, we'll go through, we'll play a game, and we'll pick and choose who has what person. If I'm not there tomorrow, whoever fills in for me can do that. It'll be done in a week, so you'll have until next Tuesday or Wednesday. I'll write it up here, and I haven't written it up yet, so I'll write it up and put it on there, and then you also have a homework assignment for today. So hopefully everything's going well, and I hope that I see you tomorrow, but if I don't, Wednesday at the latest, hopefully. All right. Have a good day. Bye.